Welcome to today's UNICON webinar. The subject for today's webinar is Designing the UNICON 2015 Conference. My name is Frank Kennedy and I'm Executive Director of Executive Education at AGSM at UNSW Business School. The theme of our webinar today is learning in and from context and whole person learning and experiential learning. And the example that we'll be going through is the design of the UNICON Executive Directors Conference held in South Africa in Johannesburg 13th to the 15th of April this year, and that was hosted by the Gordon Business Institute of Science, University of Pretoria. The conference aimed to address the needs of global executive education designers and developers, specifically exploring a unique context enabling an understanding of the different markets in Africa, reflecting on the role of learning and learning from others, experimenting with a range of different learning methodologies with a focus on learning from the whole person's perspective, and sharing experiences, expertise and knowledge. The conference theme was Leading Learning in Dynamic Markets, and the key takeouts for participants of the conference included a deeper awareness of the economic value of Africa as a whole continent, samples of learning approaches which can be transferred to dynamic markets and context, and new methodologies which enhance design. I'd now like to introduce the facilitator of today's event, Dr. Lucy Voss-Price. Lucy is Director of Custom Programs at the Gordon Institute of Business Science at the University of Pretoria and is a member of the UNICON board. Lucy has 20 years of management, leadership development, education and training experience and has worked with corporate, non-government, government and academic learning organisations in Australia and South Africa.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Lucy Voss-Price, calling in from Johannesburg, South Africa on behalf of the Gordon Institute of Business Science, GIBS, at the University of Pretoria. Today I'm going to talk about designing and creating the UNICON Directors Conference held in Johannesburg earlier this year in April. And I start with a photograph of Johannesburg mostly because it's an snapshot, I guess, of a fairly significant city on the African continent, but more importantly because the conference focused quite heavily on speedy access to context as a way of leading learning, either as a leader or manager or a creator of learning for leaders and managers. So we called our conference Leading Learning in Dynamic Markets, and in creating this conference, we considered three things we hoped that participants would take away. Something about Africa, something about learning methods, and something about relationships. We wanted people to learn about South Africa as an example of an African market. This is not to say that Africa is the only broad continent to learn about, but it does have some currency in leadership and management and business expansion at the moment. It's also a particularly complex and difficult place to do business, and so that creates interesting challenges for people who have to design learning for managers and leaders. So in offering people an opportunity to learn about South Africa, we were hoping there might be a fairly sharp and acute and quick access to some things about the broader African continent. The second intent was to sample and co-create learning methods for accessing and responding to context. So in leading learning in markets that are dynamic, we intended that this conference would create learning methods, particularly assisting people participating to access context and respond to that context quite quickly. Partly because we think this is useful for people in executive education, and also because we think it's useful for those people who are benefiting from the work of those of us in executive education. And finally, we wanted obviously to offer what UNICON offers many of us, is the opportunity to learn from our peers and to build relationships. So in going through the next 30 minutes or so, I considered some of the things that you might be interested in learning about. I anticipated that the programs perhaps that you might be responsible in executive education. They explore a unique context, enabling an understanding of different markets. Your programs and therefore their participants might reflect on the role of leading the learning of others. And also that program participants in your executive education programs might share experiences, expertise and insights throughout current and new networks. And so I imagined that as a program designer or somebody responsible for encouraging others to design programs or engaging with people who might want to design programs, you needed to experiment with a range of learning devices and methodologies with a focus on whole person learning and contextual learning. I'm hoping that some of the benefits you might get from this webinar. So let me start with some of the themes that we thought we would tackle in crafting the conference. We thought we'd start with looking at the idea of contextual learning, that we'd build on the already extensive knowledge on experiential learning, and that we'd consider trying to engage the whole person in the learning. Contextual learning for us is learning in and from context, sensing contexts to learn from them and to learn about ourselves. Experiential learning, although there are many, many definitions, we were looking at engaging in an experience of knowing, being, or doing, which is the same or similar to a lived experience that I might have to navigate either in the future or which I might have navigated in the past. And it's not to be confused with experimental learning. Frequently, people create something that appears quite experimental and therefore seems to be experiential. But our intention here was to create experiences that may have some literal or metaphorical benefit in a similar lived experience outside of the learning experience it gives. And then we hoped to learn using the whole of the participant, engaging activities that were engaging people socially, emotionally, intellectually, and physically. So in everything we designed, we cross-checked against these three themes. Are we ensuring that there's learning in context and learning in and from context? Is this experiential in some way? And are we engaging the whole person, socially, emotionally, intellectually, and physically? So on this slide, I'm going to give you a very simple overview of what people saw and did on the program. And then I'm going to go into some explanation of how we came to these pieces or lumps or chunks of the learning journey on the conference. We started with a piece of content or a faculty lump, if you like, which was about why people were in the room to explore Africa now as opposed to 2 years ago or in 3 years' time, what was significant about Africa as a political and economic environment. We then went immediately on the first day into small groups, and those smaller groups went to various destinations around the city of Johannesburg. We called them contrast encounters because the primary theme that we felt was important in the context of South Africa and a large part of Africa, and I'm sure in many of your economies, was the theme of contrast. In Johannesburg, in a 5-minute drive, you can move from a shanty town of millions and millions of people living on less than $1 a day to extreme wealth and affluence and education and sophistication. You can move from an inner city suburb of lawlessness and chaos where the state is battling to contain criminal activity to the Constitutional Court, or what we call Constitution Hill, which is the site of South Africa's first democratically elected, well, constitution, which gave rise to our first democracy and democratic elections, where the rule of law is everything. So those kinds of contrasts existed, and we took delegates into those environments to experience them. That evening, we took the opportunity to create the dinner, make it into a learning experience about contrast. and I'll explain that a little bit later. It really was about what it is to experience South African food, African hospitality, but more importantly, art and currency and entrepreneurship. The next morning was a piece of faculty input again by Moletsi Mbeki. This was really talking about growth. Given that there is this African possibility, can it grow? And this was a fairly exciting session, apart from the fact that there are obviously very significant hindrances to Africa's growth, most notably regulatory matters, institutional voids, infrastructural voids, and various distribution and developmental industrialization challenges. We then broke delegates into smaller groups again, and we had what we call learning in context streams. These were dialogue sessions with 3 possible groups of experts, or should we just say people having different experience. Global heads for African businesses growing in Africa was one. People creating small and medium enterprises was another, and then social enterprises was a third, people involved in youth and women development. And we had facilitated sessions in which delegates could ask the guests questions. Then another piece of faculty input, again about the state of the nation, and we explored a museum. It's Nelson Mandela Center of Memory. Obviously the most distinctive thing about South Africa is Nelson Mandela himself, but as an example of leading learning, he had some significant failings, and we spent an hour with his private archiver, who took us through some of the things that made Nelson Mandela's leadership legacy great, and some which were less great and less publicized. We then had a dinner, and you'll see some pictures of how we made that into a learning experience as well. And the next morning spent a lot of time on making the memory stick. We loved the double entendre, what you say, a pun of a memory stick, because each person got a memory stick as well, capturing the week. But we did a fairly extensive exercise, reflection exercise, in which people embedded and linked what they had learned to what they were going back to at work. So it's a very simple overview. We finally ended with a young man, 23, who's managed to create a very large and extensive business by being a driven and inventor and entrepreneur, and he was able to, I guess, uplift delegates towards the end. So I want to spend a bit of time talking about the devices we used. I've simply listed them, and I will explain them, and I'll link them back to our 3 themes. But I guess I was thinking these are things many of you will use and play with and explore every day in your design lives. But I figured we'd highlight a couple of the ones that we think made the conference more successful. The first is what we call an integrator. This is the role of somebody who holds the learning together. This person, Morris, as you can see on the screen, had been briefed to ensure that each experiential piece, as well as each faculty content piece, as well as each social engaging piece, was linked together to the learning outcomes that the 3 learning outcomes that I listed at the beginning, as well as he was instructed or guided to create enough time for each person in each group to deepen and embed their learning. To give you an idea, it was a 2.5-day conference. We spent roughly 4 to 5 hours integrating in that process. We have a set of integration guidelines. I'm sure many of you do too. It's quite a lot more than an MC. It's a lot more than a program director, and it's fully present person, not simply a faculty lead. We had, of course, faculty and content. Wow faculty and wow content are some things that business schools around the world leverage a lot better than us certainly, but very, very good faculty we chose to expose these guests from around the world and locally to best thinking in Africa, about learning and about leadership and management. We spent a lot of time ensuring that the learning involved people talking with each other on task. So there is a lot of work, especially in conferences, less so in learning programs, but especially in conferences, that involves quickly getting people into a buzz group and then taking a couple of words from the room. We felt that given that we were talking about whole person learning, this was a fairly important part of what we did. And so each on-task talking session had a set of guiding questions and a framework. You can see it was, in many cases, quite fun. So to build on this talking to task theme, one of the devices we used was structured reflection, and on the screen you're seeing simply two examples of very simple structured reflection that we built. So if one of the outcomes was to learn more about Africa as an example of an African market, we crafted a few activities which helped the delegates to answer the questions, what have you learned about Africa that has surprised you, for example, or what have you learned about Africa that you can use? And we used a range of devices to record these, either on flip chart, post-it notes, private personal reflection, in pairs, in groups, and towards the end of the session we started creating stories about these that wove the answers to these reflective devices together. The second one was, for instance, asking delegates to consider what learning devices had been used the day before and structurally what had worked. Since we're talking to learning professionals, we wanted each day to reflect on some of the things that they had learned and what about the learning had worked that they could create in their own organizations for their clients. We were very conscious about space. I do come from a theatre background, and so for many years I've spent some time thinking about what space means. On the top right is simply our business school, and we leveraged everything we could about the space. The art that was on display that week, we have different art every month at Gibbs. The social spaces as well as spaces off-site. So at the bottom left is the museum I spoke about, which was created from a social energetic energy, top left, to this personal reflective absorbing intellectual energy of the bottom left. We were making sure that each encounter, each hour or two of the program chose a space that had a purpose linking back to the learning intent of the program. Like many business schools, like all business schools I think, we played with props. These are the standard props, I guess, that you see on any program, but we made sure that each day there was a new prop that might spark a new piece of thinking, a book, a journal, a tool, and many of these props, which you'll see in future slides, helped people to link or connect or start a conversation about a previous piece of learning. This is an obvious one, of course. This is social engagement that is not on task. It is really a large part of what UNICON conferences are all about, as many of you will know. And so we built in what we felt almost was too much time, but it still was not enough, for people to talk about their work and their life. Many times on our campus, when things are running behind time, the facilitator or lecturer will simply say, let's take 20 minutes for lunch instead of an hour. And that's a great way to save time when you're driving through content. But it's not a great way to develop the learning if one of your learning outcomes is that people are learning from each other and connecting with each other. Another thing that we built into the design was an element of surprise. Now, why we thought surprise was important is because if one of our intentions was to use tools that access context, context very seldom when you walk into it decides to be what you want it to be. And so we felt we would play with that a little bit and allow the context to be quite surprising, both spatially, as I listed before, as well as the destinations people went to on day 1 and day 2. And then this was a particular example of a surprise. We were viewing and exploring the Nelson Mandela Center of Memory Museum. We were intermingled with a group of students, scholars from a local school, who, while we were busy chatting and observing the history of Nelson Mandela, started to sing. So we found ourselves caught in a flash mob. Now, you might just say this is a gimmick, this is a nice cheesy way to pull the heartstrings, but there was a very careful intent sitting behind this surprise element. The first was we were about to go into a session about Nelson Mandela, what he left behind and what he battled to leave behind and what he was sad about that didn't make its mark in his legacy. As a preamble to that, these are the young South Africans who, in the 20 years since democracy, have grown up completely free, if you like, in a completely democratic environment. So this is part of Nelson Mandela's legacy. Secondly, they sang a number of songs that related to Nelson Mandela's history. Thirdly, we were trying to explore with the delegates how to trigger emotions in programs, emotions in participants of programs. And I think music and sound and youth combined with surprise are all ways to trigger emotions. The emotions have to go somewhere and they need to be used for something, but as a device to find those emotions and bring them out, this was definitely a significant one. You can see all the delegates there making a record of the experience on their phones and tablets. Another device we jam-packed into this program was one of dialogue. Now, there's a lot been said about generative dialogue, and I don't claim that we are, I personally am an expert in this, but we did want to make sure that faculty content lumps were possibly interactive but more lecture-y type engagement. In context, experiential learning was group and individual facing stuff as it came up for them and as they encountered context. And then this was a fairly formalized dialogue about certain themes. What you see on the screen there are simply 3 dialogue briefs that we gave to the delegates to choose from in part of the session. And so the dialogue was also fairly well framed, rather like the reflection tasks or the discussion tasks. There was a facilitator, an opening question, an opening set of expectations and questions from the participants. Then a panel of experts spoke about their experiences against, again, a framework of what happened, what are some of the intellectual inputs, social inputs, emotional inputs, depending on what they were talking about. And then a closing set of questions and dialogue between the two with an explanation before of how we're going to talk with each other. So it was not only having the talk, it was learning about how to talk. This is simply a bit of fun, but I'd like to emphasize again, it's the physical, emotional, social, tactile engagement. You're engaging the whole person. I never thought I would see some of those people drum or dance or have their faces painted, but I did. And it was certainly a big way to address the third learning outcome or the third outcome of the course, conference, which is that people learn from each other, connect with each other, and build relationships internationally that they can use later on. So I spoke earlier about props, and we made sure that there were a number of devices in the program that triggered social responses that got people talking, or emotional responses that got people connecting with their emotions about the 3 themes of the program. On the left, you'll see one form of ritual, which was introduced on the second night for dinner, just the ritual simply of washing one's hands. It's not a distinctive habit. It's something all cultures do, but it was elevated by the ritual of washing one's hands for dinner. That created a certain level of conversation. We used a lot of music and art, both at the social engagement, mostly at the social engagement times. You'll see those large puppets there. And then we used story. This was a funny product. We didn't use it consciously until we designed a final reflection for day 3. But then we realized that story had been a consistent theme over the 3 days. On the right-hand side, you'll see Klina Mhlope, who's a South African storyteller of note. She's a sort of iconic figure in South Africa and tells the most beautiful stories And on the bottom you'll see a number of the delegates looking into a fun camera, creating their own stories and records of the journey that they were having with each other that evening. So the next few slides before I sign off are just going to address this critical element of accessing context at speed in a group in a particular environment. So this is the final device I'm going to talk about, but it has a number of slides because it's the dominant tool that we use, or the dominant theme that we drove through the program. It's our understanding that accessing context has 4 elements. It's evolving all the time, and we might improve this or enhance it, but there's always a pre-brief, then a place that this needs to take place, then a storyteller that has to tell you some kind of story about that place, and of course a story, and then a debrief. Now, what's important about the difference between a storyteller and a story is that a storyteller can't be there without having a story, and you simply can't really tell somebody else's story in the same way. So those two are quite distinct and important elements. So I'll start with the pre-brief. The pre-brief for our first day contrast encounter immersions. Those immersions I spoke about, the delegates were broken into groups and went to contrasting environments in order to accelerate their ability to access contexts, especially contexts that they might be not unfamiliar with. There were a couple of elements of this pre-brief. The first was that they were provided with a written brief of where they were going, how long it would take, what they would be doing. This is a sort of formal safety net, I guess. It gives people a sense of ownership and control in what otherwise might be a quite fragile journey. And those written under immersion brief are 2 briefs that we gave the delegates of 2 of the experiences that we created for them on day 1. The second part of a pre-brief is to break, before you go, into small groups with a very skilled facilitator to set up 2 things. The first is some kind of conceptual framework about how you're going to take on what it is you see and you hear and you experience. It doesn't really matter what conceptual framework you use, so long as there's something theoretical that people can place their thoughts and feelings into as they go through the experience. In fact, each facilitator who took a group that day used a different framework. That was the first thing. The second part of the pre-brief is that every facilitator made sure there was a set of rules of engagement, if you like, or how to be. So, for instance, we find with a lot of our engagements, if our executives and managers are underexposed in extremely poor environments, they find the need, or they feel the need to assist. And the need to assist poor people who are themselves entrepreneurs making a difference in their communities comes up for them very strongly. And we need to manage that this journey is not about handing over a $100 bill. This journey is about learning and co-learning, both with the people you're meeting as well as with your peers that you're with. So there are a couple of rules, or should we say principles, that we set out early on about how to behave on an immersion and how to manage what you're experiencing intellectually, physically, and emotionally. The second part of accessing context as a process is place. Now, we spent a lot of time choosing places for our delegates to go to, and this is a fairly nuanced thing to have to do. Many of you will take groups to all sorts of places around the world to learn about business and leadership and change. We find that choosing places is very important, mostly because it's got to be a place where people can engage. If they simply observe, there's a certain distance that's experienced. And in creating distance, you're removing the person from great learning opportunities. So we chose quite carefully places where the participants could learn from people, talk to people, touch things, taste things, see things, smell things, and live, if you like, inside the world of other people. The next two elements of storyteller and story. These are two photographs from one of the groups that went out on our first day. And what's interesting about storyteller is observing what goes on in an environment is one thing, but hearing people speak about it is a much deeper experience. So on the left-hand side, we had a student of a school talking to a number of the delegates who chose to go on this immersion about his experiences as a student in a very low-income area, trying to make it in the education system that is fairly fraught with a lot of inequity and challenges. On the right-hand side, what you see is stories simply emerging by the careful selection of place. So the fact that you've chosen a careful place and you've embedded, if you like, embedded delegates inside the place and inside the people of that place, stories start emerging. So you'll see at the back of the classroom, there's a delegate asking a student about his life and having a conversation, and the two of them are co-creating a story that each of them will take away that evening. And in the foreground, there's a 3 or 4 part story being generated between the people in the front. So the two elements that are necessary is there must be a compelling story to be told, either a story of hope or a story of struggle or a story of making business work or a story of leadership, whatever it is that makes a difference to your learning outcomes. And the second element is having somebody to tell that story. Then as there are storytellers around, delegates start to build on those stories to create their own stories. And the last part of accessing context is debrief. Now, it seems pretty obvious to put a pre-brief and a debrief into any kind of learning activity, but it is often neglected. And so the debrief goes back to the conceptual framework created when each small group met their facilitator. The debrief asks how delegates experienced the journey and helps them to embed and reflect and share with others what it is they saw and heard and felt. And most importantly, what they learned, because our contextual immersions are very often, people are broken into different groups and can learn a lot from each other at an accelerated pace by going to one venue and then learning from somebody else about another venue. I put these two photos in because there are 3 types of, or maybe more, debrief going on here. There's a fairly formal individual debrief on the right, where there's a question being asked and people are being invited to reflect on it and record their thinking. On the left-hand side, there's a peer-to-peer sharing. Here's what I saw, this is what I experienced. And in the background is paired group work of discussing against the questions set out that relate to the conceptual framework how the experience was for them. So that brings us to the end of the final and perhaps the most significant device, the device of accessing context. And that device, I've hoped, has helped you by breaking it down into 5 particular steps and, shall we say, non-negotiable elements. So it has been a great experience to facilitate the UNICON Directors Conference. Teaching and learning with people who create teaching and learning every day of their lives was a very uplifting experience for me and my team, as well as the whole school. And it was a great opportunity. Thank you.